Hi, I'm Angelo Robles at Family Office Association. Welcome to our FOA Successful Families Project on Leadership. Today's panelists include Dennis Jaffe, Freda Hertz-Brown of Relative Solutions, Don Trone of 3 Ethos, Pierre DuPont of HPM Partners, Scott Wakeman of Family Navigation Strategies, and Sharna Goldsecker of 2164. Hello everyone, I'm Angelo Robles at Family Office Association. Welcome today to our FOA Successful Families Project. The next session is on leadership. Don, from your research and experience, what are the most important attributes of a leader?
Great question. And I can tell you the attributes have changed dramatically in the last 5 years. Society today no longer prefers to see the top-down command and control style of leadership. There's certain attributes people prefer to see in a leader today. In our research, we've identified 10 attributes, and we can divide them into 2 tenets. The first is a leader needs to be inspirational. Second, the leader needs to be seen as being selfless. Then with each of those 2, we've got 4 more attributes that support. So in the case of being inspirational, the leader needs to be seen as being conscientious, competent, courageous, and trustworthy. And then selfless, of being of service to others. The attributes, the leader needs to be seen as being purposeful, passionate, practical, and engaging.
Freda, the perception of a leader is someone who is strong, someone who potentially is a little bit domineering, although the perspective that Don gave about that way of being a leader, and I'll use 2 corporate icons, a Lee Iacocca, a Jack Welch, and I believe they would have adapted and been amazing leaders today, but they were very strong, big personalities. Taking that perception to a family, does that type of top-down approach, perhaps even a little bit of negative motivation, is that applicable in today's leadership within a family?
The top-down approach?
Yes.
No. I think that what Don portrayed is exactly what we're seeing more and more in families, is the desire to be, first, that there are more than one leader in a family, that there are many opportunities for leadership in a family, and leadership is not just assigned to a position, but there are many people in a family who can lead. And I think being able to be agile, get other people on board, show that you're trustworthy, show that you have the family support, show that you can lead in the sense of setting a direction and helping people move in a shared vision is always important for that. And I also think that within the context of family, you've got at least 3 generations moving in lockstep, so that also shifts some of it. I recently saw the Broadway show, King Charles. I don't know whether anybody else has seen it, but I think it is a great portrayal of the changes in leadership and what happens when you have a middle generation, which we have a lot of nowadays, 50-year-old people who have been in waiting for their leadership to come, as if you have to be in waiting. So the question is, how do you help people across all those 3 generations bring out some of those leadership qualities so that they can be better citizens of the world and of their families?
And Scott, I'm going to turn my attention to you. A unique perspective currently as an advisor to successful families, having come from a substantial family that had a substantial business enterprise which you were involved in. Would you say that leaders are born? Are they made? What kind of experiences did you have in your family and family business?
They're born and they're made. My father was one who was born, and I looked at his leadership style as very entrepreneurial. He was very clear on what he wanted to accomplish and what he wanted his sons to accomplish. But as the business flowed downstream to the next generation, in our case we had 3 siblings, the shift in leadership went from entrepreneurial to consensus. And I think that that's something that's very critical when you get to a second generation, is that you are now sharing the load with others within the family. And to other points that have been brought up here, it's important to involve others in different leadership roles within the family enterprise so that everyone feels that they are involved.
And Dennis, is not leadership kind of an intersection of stewardship and governance as well?
Well, there's an old distinction that was made between leadership and management. And management is doing the same thing, but doing it effectively and getting things done. And leadership is seeing the right things to do and doing them. And I think in families that I'm seeing today, the next generation is saying, well, it isn't just enough to make money. We have money. What's it all for? And the leadership function are people that step up and say, here is what we could be doing that's important, which is finding something new. Here are ways to make a difference. Here are things that we can do as a family that we hadn't considered, and it's kind of bringing the family into new territory. And so it means spotting ideas, finding opportunities. It means getting allies in the family, and getting people enrolled who maybe are older generation, people who are resistant, people who don't see you as legitimate. And there are a number of functions that come up in being a next generation leader in the family that are traditional leadership functions, but also specific for the challenge that the family is facing.
And Sharna, for a rising generation in the family that is learning the business, that is learning the principles of quote unquote becoming a leader, that must be a lot of pressure. Not everyone necessarily wants to be the sole decision maker, and arguably in today's society that may not necessarily be best. One of you mentioned consensus being a way that has become more commonplace in today's world. For someone younger that is rising in that position, is there a sense of pressure in needing to become a leader?
As Dennis mentioned, the Peter Drucker quote, management tries to do things right and leaders try to do the right things. The question for the next generation is how to cultivate a sense of values and an internal compass to understand what doing the right things means. How do they make those choices? Really, I think the bedrock is helping next generation family members find their own sense of identity. So as they move from adolescence to adulthood, as they individuate, they differentiate, they become their own person, we overlay a sense of awareness, of skills, of our environment, of inspiration, of conscientiousness, all of those attributes that we've heard in this panel discussion. But how does someone feel that internally? We believe they have to not only inherit that feeling of legacy and stewardship, but also their own moral compass, their own sense of values and priorities with which to make their decisions.
Don?
You know, combining what Shauna and Scott both said, going back to the question, are leaders born or made? The answer is yes. But I think one of the most important contributors to leadership is experience. So you go back to Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers, and he talks about the fact it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert, fill in the blank, playing the pianos, programming a computer. It's the same with leadership. And when we talk about family enterprise, putting a family member inside the family business may not be the best way to give that family member that leadership experience, counting the hours up to 10,000 hours of leadership experience. One of the things we recommend is get them outside the family business. Put them in an authentic leadership experience where the family name's not going to make a difference, where they're going to have to learn to become more resilient, learn how to fail, go through the experiences that most leaders, like Scott's father, you know, when he talks about being an entrepreneur, he went through certain life experiences to get to that concept of leadership.
And Pierre, not only in your current role as an advisor, but someone who's from an iconic American name that goes back hundreds of years in business and success, do you believe that it's important for the generations to share stories, how the business was started, the challenges we had, the successes? Do you believe in sharing stories to tell generations to come?
Absolutely. There's no question that knowing where you came from, particularly for younger generations, there are a lot of challenges, some liabilities may come with a name. Knowing why you have them, knowing that you are stewarding that name on into future generations, the stories are essential for that. And in both of my families, we propagate a lot of stories, particularly for that reason, I think, in part.
And Sharna, taking that perspective of the rising generation, should they be more eager to get out of the older generation stories, concepts about how the family's wealth originated? Are they inquisitive enough?
There's this terrific research out of Emory University by Robin Fibish and Marshall Duke, who asked the next generation, do you know? 20 questions about their family's legacy. And to Pierre's point, the kids who knew the most were incredibly self-reliant, were resilient even. Some families told ascending narratives, so we had little and we were greatly successful. Some families told descending narratives. We had a lot, and perhaps the next generation lost it. And those next generations who were most successful and most resilient came from families where the narratives they call were oscillating, where they understood the family went through peaks and troughs, had successes and challenges, and were able to weather them, so that the next generation themselves felt that they were capable of weathering whatever arose in their path.
And Freda, this must be a challenge for families really around the world. The generation that follows the entrepreneur that created the wealth, if we only define success by creating great wealth, there's very few that are going to be wealth creators, and they'll admit that luck, dynamics, and timing played a part of it. How could that second generation, how do they define success? Are they afraid to lose it? But that doesn't unleash their talents in the right way. The second generation must be a difficult one.
Yeah, well, look at King Charles, you know, Prince Charles. It is a difficult situation, especially when the elders in very many families nowadays are not passing away as quickly as they were before. So you not only have the image of success that gets passed down in the stories, and I think some of those stories where the elder is held in such high esteem and you never point out the negatives of the elders are oftentimes hindering. So for instance, I don't know other people, but I recently sat with a family where the only thing they could talk about 3 generations back was Grandpa and how successful he was, etc. But these oscillating stories are really the stories that really count. And so for the second generation, to begin to define, where is my success? What will make my mark? Beginning to think about that. And I think as professionals, we need to focus more on helping them develop some processes, putting them through a process of evolution of their development, not so much teaching them a set of information like we have financial knowledge. You see those kinds of courses, financial knowledge being offered, governance knowledge being offered. Those things, the content is important, but more the ability to be agile, resilient, see things and be able to figure out how you're going to make a decision. How do you bring other people along with you? How do you evaluate your type of leadership versus the leadership you're seeing in others? Asking the right questions is really what's important for their own success, the next generation down.
Dennis?
Yeah, I've noticed something very interesting coming up in families, which is that with the longer-lived people, when they're reaching 60, 70, even 80, they have to do some learning about their own leadership. And what they have to do is say, well, I've done something, I've been very successful for 30 years, and now, oh gosh, I have to learn something new. I have to learn a new role in the family, or I'll be stifling the energy and the creativity and the initiative of the next generation. And so I find that the older generation has to learn a new role of being a non-operational steward, mentor, maybe go out and do something in the community, become an ambassador, as we're talking about in one family that I'm seeing where the older generation have stopped being CEOs and now they're ambassadors, allowing the next generation to take leadership, but using and benefiting from the wisdom that they have of knowing clients, knowing people all over the world, having an incredible network, but not holding back the next generation. So I think the next generation can't thrive and can't grow unless there's a growing medium of the older generation creating space for them to be leaders, which is a new type of leadership for the elders.
I think that's one of the original, back to the very first point about leadership and what are the characteristics. recognizing that the wealth one may be passing on to one's children and grandchildren isn't necessarily there to have them propagate the business. May well be, but it's to give them the capabilities to do what empowers them, to do what lets them become an entrepreneur. And so a leader in the beginning, or at any stage, having the wisdom to recognize, I need to provide opportunity. I need to allow my descendants to evolve in the way that they will, and maybe contribute something new to this family instead of where we started. That's an essential part of, at all stages, being a leader in the family.
And Scott, especially someone coming from a business-owning family, the perception is that a first-generation entrepreneur, they're type A, they're so engrossed in the business 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 5, 7 days a week. Does that second generation get the love, the attention, the focus when that driving force is maybe not around as much? How could they expect to become a leader or find their bliss if they see their parents, 10 minutes a week? Was that a challenge you had in your business?
My regular experience with my father was that I would spend Saturdays traveling to the office with him as part of my father-son time. And my first lesson in cash flow was when we showed up at the post office and he would pile up the bills on one side and the checks on the other, and I could watch the perspiration coming down his forehead as he added up the bills and realized he didn't have enough money coming in to pay the bills. So my experience at 9 years old was one of business and one of parenting, both. So I had the luxury of being just old enough when he was starting the business to have an appreciation for what he was going through on the business side. But we bonded as a father and son at an early age, and so I instinctively became kind of part of the business at a very, very early age. So my experience as a son was amazing. He carved out time and managed to kind of whittle me into his business world in a way that still allowed us to operate as both business people and a father and a son. So I felt very, very blessed and very fortunate.
The world has changed a lot, obviously, even from those days. But my father, who was not in a family business particularly, he made a point, this is back in the 60s and 70s, of reserving Sundays as family time. No one's going to do that today, unfortunately, with this and so on. So indeed, finding a mechanism, and this, like what your father did, is a very good mechanism of some bonding time, but also some business education. I think that's the true challenge of a leader in a family, of a parent for that matter, is how to do his or her career, what is self-fulfilling and valuable for the family there, while giving the children the opportunity to grow and go where they want to go, and passing on the lessons that can only be taught by direct contact, that you can't learn in school.
And Sharna, is it important for that wealth creator, a little bit like Scott noted, to share the personal experience? And maybe I'll bring in another element. It's not all rosy. Sometimes early on in the business there are challenges. Is it scary to someone who's preteen or teen to scare the fact that we're undergoing challenges? This is not all rosy. It's not all going up. Do you only share the good, or do you share the bad as well?
Notions of parenting have evolved over time, but one of the core facets remains the parents who can help their children grow into independence, where children can move from adolescence to adulthood and take care of themselves, is still a core tenet of parenting. And so these experiences of parents bringing their children to experience life's choices with them, right, the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows, the opportunities and the challenges, are giving their children skills with which to grapple the rest of their lives. And furthermore, I think the parents who we've seen and children who we've seen move into business together have moved from a parent-child relationship to one of peerage as adults, where both have values, skills, and experiences to bring to bear on the business that they only achieve by seeing each other as respected adults.
And Dennis, a question for you. What qualities are needed as a family leader that are different than being the leader of a family business?
Well, you see, after the first generation, the major roles in the family are not necessarily leading the business. There is, for example, serving the family, which is being part of governance, being part of a board, being part of an advisory group. There's governance, the family council. A lot of next generation people say, aha, I'm going to serve the family by helping the family develop an educational program or
take initiative. And then there are people that see opportunities to be entrepreneurial and say, here's something we could be doing. Here's a way we can expand in different markets. So there are many ways to go in the next generation. I think the next generation, we're seeing people that become leaders by seeing something that the older generation doesn't see, and then they're in a tough position. They haven't been given power of authority, but they see something important, and that's what we call leadership, without authority, where they have to step up and they have to enroll the older generation. They have to get allies. They have to push and challenge the family to go into new directions. And that idea of what we call a family champion is a new role that I think people in the next generation families are using to kind of counter the challenge of business stagnating and the family losing its way.
Absolutely. Don?
It's an interesting question. The attributes are the same, but the family is more challenging because it's 24/7. It's still, the leader needs to be inspiring and engaging. Well, in a corporate world, you can put trappings around you to appear to be inspiring. The big corporate office, the corporate jet, the entourage, having to go through, umpteen administrative assistants to get a conversation. Family, that's not the case. You've got to be there at the end of a long day. You're tired, you're stressed out, and still be a source of inspiration for the family, to still be engaging with fellow members. So I think the attributes are the same, but the challenges are much more difficult for the family.
Yes, Freda.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the things that I think both of you are sort of talking about is that the person who is usually the first generation, I hate these generational things, but the wealth provider usually had the title in the family as well as the title in the business. And I think what ends up happening for the next generations is they have to sort of evolve what their leadership role is, and they have to evolve and get the family on board to the different, as Dennis was saying, the family on board to the different leadership styles and ways they can operate, because it doesn't come with the position. It doesn't come with being the dad, and it doesn't come with being the head of the business anymore. It's something that you have to be able to carve out and to define for yourself and to bring other people along into that process. And that demands, as we were talking about before, it demands some knowledge of yourself and your family. You can't just do it by position. You have to sort of have an understanding of what's my family about, and how am I going to, who am I here, and how do I gain the trust of people in my family to maneuver and be who I need to be.
Scott, does a rising generation need one person to stand up and become the family leader, or better to have several?
I'm a believer with one person at the top of a family business entity, but again, there's a sharing and a consensus of roles and leadership for the remaining pieces, which would include family, children, grandchildren. There is a way to incorporate a more horizontal leadership structure involving the family, and that enhances the communication. To support what was said by Don earlier, I'm thinking about the challenges of leadership in a business versus family. A leader in a business has a team with people who have job descriptions. They wake up to a set of goals and objectives every day, and they have accountability. The rawness of a family is that you have raw emotion on the table where people are trying to find themselves, they're struggling with their own identities. And so when you start to deal with the leadership of a family, it requires a very, very unique set of tools to manage through what is, in most cases, somewhat undefinable at every moment of the day in comparison to an operating entity.
And Don, how does a family create leaders in that rising generation?
I'd go back to an earlier comment about the 10,000 hours. The family's got to give the up-and-coming young men and women the opportunity to serve in authentic leadership roles, not simply serve in the family business, but go out and do something on their own. I think the other thing too, if we're talking about training and development, I think it's critical for families to allow the next generation to fail.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very important.
Sharna, please.
So piggybacking on the last few comments, there's this expression my colleague has given me, that the next generation feels so much responsibility and so much pressure, as Freda said, to lead in the family and lead in the business, that there's often paralysis by predecessor, paralysis by prosperity, and paralysis by possibility of everything one could do in that situation. And so I believe that the greatest gift that the previous generation, the owning generation, the wealth creator could give the next generation is the opportunity to fail.
Absolutely.
Right? To practice something, to experiment, to find one's own self as a leader sometimes requires trying things that don't always work, so that the next opportunity is a success.
And getting back up again.
Yeah, exactly.
Dennis?
I just is saying that I think that it's hard sometimes to do that in the family because it's public. There are sometimes employees and people that are watching so closely that I think a young person in a family needs to have a way of getting out and doing that privately. I think that sometimes it sounds good to say fail in the family, but in some families I've seen people never forget their first failure, and when someone is outside and they're working in another job or they're not part of the family, they get a chance to fail. No one knows about it, and then they come back, and it's easier to develop their credibility and their sense of leadership. So this is where I think the opportunity to be outside the family for a period of time is really important, because sometimes failing visibly is a good ethic, but it's hard in practice. When you actually have done it, can you ever outlive it, and can you really feel good about yourself in recovering?
And Pierre, I'm going to put that question on you, given, again, an iconic last name. It must be even harder when the perception, not just eyes watching you within the family, but a name that other families are going to know if you're going to work in your career or starting an endeavor at a young age. It has to be successful. And we define money as successful. That must be a tremendous amount of pressure for heirs, if I could use that word, with a globally renowned name.
Sure, obviously, no-brainer. The chip on the shoulder, the expectations amongst everyone you meet, and again, the older generation, the leaders in the family, have to find ways to help the younger generation deal with that and get past it. And I have many cousins in my family, some of whom succeed with that, some of whom don't. It's not really possible to determine why. I think I couldn't give you any. I don't know them well enough to give you an indication as to what allowed them to handle that name pressure, if you will, better than others might. But wrestling with that early and always, I think, is very important, because that will clamp down on any potential for self-fulfillment, for empowerment to achieve, the young person's goals, his or her own goals, or even running the business, if there is that name burden on top of it. So it can be a big issue.
And Sharna, at the risk of getting a little bit of off topic, not everyone wants to go and be an entrepreneur or work in the family business. There's nothing wrong with being a teacher, a dancer. If you have freedom from wealth of others that came before you within the family that are sharing and open, they're a leader in their own way. What's wrong with that?
I agree. I think in lower middle income families, children are raised and launched. You're lucky to have the opportunity to go to college perhaps, but you're on your own to find your own path, make your own choices about your career, your industry, your relationships. And I think it gets complicated in families where there is wealth and other resources, because we're not yet ready to transfer perhaps the wealth. And so we often forget to transfer the autonomy.
When you're maybe early on in the creation of some wealth or a business, thinking a few generations out and how you're going to empower grandchildren and great-grandchildren, you may never know if there's that magnitude of a business or wealth, to do whatever they want to do and to give them opportunities to do that. So one simple example is, within a family that has had some financial success, there's more than the business. There might be some very specific charitable activities There might be, there is in fact as the family gets bigger, an education opportunity for educating my cousins or my nieces and nephews. Empowering some of the younger generation to handle those tasks outside of the business can be one way to achieve some of that.
Don?
I don't know whether this research has ever been done, but imagine taking a cross-section of first graders from all different types of backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, put them in a room and do the classic first grade teacher instruction being draw a picture of what you want to become when you grow up. And I bet you every child in that room is drawing a selfless servant, the teacher, the fire, the police officer, the doctor. It's part of our genetic background, part of our DNA to be of service to others, to have a sense of purpose. You know, this morning's session on purpose. And sociologists will tell you that those who are most functional in the world and happiest in the world are those who come closest to that sense of purpose. Money is not a sense of purpose, but if we can use the money to fulfill a sense of purpose, that's a more rewarding life.
And Don, sticking with you, you define, I believe it's 10 attributes of ethodic leadership. If you could share them with the audience, please.
Sure. Well, we started off by defining leadership, and we gave the 10 attributes. The additional attributes on ethodic leadership, first of all, to define the term ethodic, comes from the ancient Greek word ethos, meaning the continuum and balance between behavior, core values, decision making. So the modern expression of the ethos would be the continuum between leadership, stewardship, and governance. So this term ethodic leadership is a new term that means it's somebody who can demonstrate that they have a continuum between their leadership, stewardship, and governance. You see a consistency. No matter where you touch them in their life, in the corporate world, when they're home with the family, when they're out in the community and a philanthropic, you see the same individual emerge. So those 10 attributes we really associate with stewardship, which we define as the glue between leadership and governance is stewardship. That's what makes effective decision making and leadership come together, is the sense of stewardship. So those 10 attributes, the person needs to be aligned, attentive, agile, adaptive, accepting, articulate, ardent, action-oriented, accountable, and authentic. What did they all have in common?
Process.
Hey.
Hey.
But they're all process-oriented.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah, and
Every
they're
one
all
of them.
words that if we had time and we said, think about the most influential people in your life, the mentors, the leaders in your life, what were their attributes? And we put the words up on a wall, and then we came back together and said, think about the most effective decision makers and project managers you've ever worked with. What are their attributes? And we put those words on the opposing wall, and then stood in the middle of the room and said, okay, what words appear on both walls that describe a great leader and a great decision maker? And we actually did that research. So there's about 250 words, potential words in the English language to describe a leader. Almost the exact same number to describe a great decision maker. And the 10 words that are common to both lists, I'll start with A. And that kind of puts the hair up on the back of your neck, you know, when you see that kind of research emerge.
Indeed. Dennis, would it almost seem artificial or a little contrived to say that a family that has a rising generation or generations upcoming, that you observe them, who is selfless, basically who has the inner talents that still need to be honed, but potentially have leadership within them? Is that easy to identify? Is it a myth?
Well, I mean, I think you look at the qualities that we're talking about in ethodic leadership. Those are things that is good for everybody. It isn't, oh well, I'm not going to be a leader, so I'm not going to be authentic, and I'm, you know, not, you want to develop that in the next generation as a matter of course. So I feel that families that have means want to make an investment in the future, and the investment is to grow great people. And so what they're doing is to help people develop the qualities of character to succeed in social role, in service roles, in family leadership, family governance, and running family business, the family foundation. There are many, many ways, and so the family focuses on developing the human capital rather than on saying, well, you're the leader, you're going to be our high potential, and you people, let's forget about you. That doesn't make any sense in a family where everybody is valued equally, even if they have different talents and different capabilities.
So,
Well,
Andrew,
Freda?
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree that the effort ought to be there, but there usually is, in my experience, one or two people who sort of rise to the surface, who have all those capabilities. You may be working on it with all of them, but one or two who say, I'm up for the task.
Yeah.
I want to do something more with this, and I want, and you sort of you gravitate towards those people and help them to sort of pull themselves along a little bit more. But I think Dennis is right. You're really looking to do that in a whole generation of people, is to help them develop in all of those ways. That's really important ways for everybody. And I want to also go back to something Sharna said. I think we keep acting as if there's this group of people, the wealthy, the people who are economically advantaged. And I think parenting is parenting, whether you're just parenting for a group of people who have many more complexities that they're going to have to deal with in life, which have to do a lot, I think, with some of the other subjects you're going to get into, which is fiduciary and all of those issues that have to do with your responsibility and accountability, which becomes even greater when you're in a complex situation. But I really want us to think about this as it's a broader, every family is interested, every parent is interested in raising children who are going to meet the qualities that Dennis was just talking about. And in increasingly complex worlds, it's going to be a greater challenge for those young people to meet those and be able to muster it up to do it.
And Sharna, I'm assuming, like in leadership, in parenting, with a younger generation that may be in their 20s and 30s and have young children, they're going to take some of the principles that are probably timeless in terms of being, quote unquote, a good parent, and effectively raising in their own way, quote unquote, individuals and leaders. But there probably have been some dynamics that have changed over the years. We're a more open, a more global society. There's a variety of different factors. Do you see that to be a continuum that is ever changing?
Mm-hmm. We see this question a lot from our clients right now, people who are concerned about raising their children among wealth where perhaps they didn't grow up in those circumstances. So we actually take time first with the parents. We say, like the flight attendants do, put on your own mask before assisting others. So we actually help the parents to think about what are their own values, what are their own money messages that they want to live by and convey to their children before they start to enact their ideas on their children. So how do we really help the parents be prepared to raise healthy, wealthy, and wise next generation?
Part of it,
Excellent
you have
point.
to live the values.
That's
you have
true.
to live the characteristics you wish to project. It's one thing to say it, but it doesn't really work if you're not also being it,
Right.
which can be hard.
I remember my father saying, Scott, you and your brothers will never know what it's like to start something from nothing. And how powerful those words were for me. And we would enter into a very healthy debate, conversation around me coming back and saying, yes, Dad, but I'm not sure you'll ever understand the requirements around stewardship once something's created. But what we shared around those conversations were similar values. And I think that that's really the core, the anchor to allowing things to go downstream to the next generation.
Similar values from a different perspective.
Exactly. And also, and I'm not sure Dad was able to do this easily because his heartbeat was the business, but to really embrace individuality among his children and encourage them to do things that had nothing to do with the wealth and nothing to do with the business. Very, very hard for somebody who's doing it 24/7. But some interesting observations on my part as a second-gen CEO and a second-gen son.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on what you were saying, Phil DuPont. From the DuPont family side, and from every family that I think who does it really well, is being able to know that children look at what you do, not what you say. and they look, especially when they get to teenage years and young adulthood, the discrepancy between what you say to me about my money messages versus the way you're living become really obvious. If you ever want somebody to show you that hole, it's a teenager who will find exactly where you're not doing it.
always there.
And they're always there.
Yeah.
And acknowledging, even, I mean, one
Yeah.
of the marks is being able to, I think, is being able to acknowledge that it's there, that I don't always live it. I try my best to be this way, but there are going to be moments when I'm not necessarily living the message that I'm trying to communicate. And being able to talk about that is really important also.
Indeed it is. On that note, everyone, we are ending the leadership session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Wow.